K9 German shepherd with chains around his neck for years desperately offers his paw for affection until a soldier did this. AK9 German shepherd, trapped in heavy chains around his neck for years, had forgotten what kindness felt like. But the moment he reached out his paw, desperate for a single touch of affection, everything changed. What happened next will bring tears to your eyes. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring you more inspiring stories like this one. Now, let's dive into a story of resilience, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a forgotten K9 and the soldier who refused to let him suffer any longer. The air was thick with the scent of rust and decay. A desolate backyard, littered with broken wood and rusting scraps, had been his world for as long as he could remember. His name had been lost to time, if he had ever been given one. The K9 German shepherd, once full of life and purpose, now stood with his ribs pressing against his frail skin, his fur matted with dirt and dried blood. The heavy chains clamped around his neck had become a part of him, sinking into his flesh, leaving scars that told a story of endless suffering. For years, he had known only hunger, thirst, and pain. His owner, if that was what he could be called, had long since stopped acknowledging his existence. The metal bowl near his paws held nothing but a layer of filth, and the water he had once lapped up was now a putrid puddle beneath him. His world was silent, except for the occasional sound of distant cars and the wind rattling through the makeshift fence that barely enclosed him. But despite everything, his heart still longed for something more. He didn't know what, just that something inside him refused to let go of the faint memory of warmth, of hands that once touched him with care. He wasn't sure if it was real or just a dream that his mind clung to in desperation. Then, one day, he heard footsteps. Not the heavy, dragging ones of the man who threw scraps at him when he remembered to, but something different, purposeful, strong. Someone was approaching. The dog's ears perked up slightly, though they barely had the strength to stand. His breath quickened. He tried to move, but the chains bit into his skin, holding him back. A cruel reminder that no matter what hope stirred in his chest, he was still trapped beyond the rusted fence. A man stood still, staring at him. The dog's weak eyes met his, and for the first time in years, he saw something he had forgotten existed: compassion. The man was in his late 30s, wearing a dusty military uniform. The patches on his sleeves marked him as a soldier. His face was rough, his eyes lined with exhaustion, but there was something gentle about the way he looked at the dog. His name was James Carter, a man who had seen the worst of humanity on the battlefield. Yet nothing had prepared him for the sight before him now. James had come to this place by accident, stopping by a nearby gas station when someone mentioned a mean, useless old mutt left to rot behind the scrapyard. Something about it unsettled him. Maybe it was a casual way the man had spoken, like a living, breathing creature meant nothing. Or maybe it was something deeper, something inside him that had been searching for purpose ever since he left active duty. Now, standing in front of the suffering animal, James felt a lump form in his throat. He had seen war, seen men break under pressure, seen lives torn apart. But this was pure cruelty. He stepped closer, his boots crunching against the dirt. The dog tensed, unsure whether to expect a blow or something worse. But James didn't raise a hand. Instead, he knelt down just beyond the fence and stretched out his palm. The shepherd hesitated, his legs shaking from weakness, his muscles barely able to hold him up. But something inside him told him to try. With the last bit of strength he had, he lifted his paw and placed it into the man's hand. The action was small, but it shattered the walls James had unknowingly built inside himself. The soldier swallowed hard, staring at the trembling, scarred paw in his grip. This dog wasn't mean. He wasn't useless. He was desperate. James clenched his jaw. He wasn't leaving without him. "Who did this to you, buddy?" he whispered, though he already knew the answer. The dog didn't respond. He only looked up, his dull eyes reflecting something that James recognized all too well: hope, fragile and fleeting. James stood, his chest tightening as he turned toward the small rundown house beside the yard. Whoever was inside had done this, and they were going to answer for it. The chains had held this dog down for years, but not for much longer. James Carter had just made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. James Carter's fist clenched as he stepped toward the small rundown house. The wooden porch creaked beneath his boots, the whole structure looking as neglected as the suffering dog outside. He knocked on the door hard. For a moment, there was silence, then the sound of shuffling inside. The door cracked open just enough for a pair of bloodshot eyes to glare at him. "What the hell do you want?" The man grumbled, his breath reeking of alcohol. He was in his 50s, his stained shirt barely covering his bloated stomach. His gaze flickered past James toward the German shepherd still sitting in the dirt, chains cutting into his neck. James took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "That dog, he's coming with me." The man scoffed. "Like hell he is." He pushed the door open wider, stepping onto the porch. "That mutt's mine." James kept his voice steady, but his tone was sharp. "You don't deserve him." The man sneered, crossing his arms. "You one of those animal rights nuts? Look, he's just a dog. He's fine." James's eyes darkened. "Fine." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the shepherd. "He's starving. The chains have dug into his skin. He's been suffering for years." The man waved a dismissive hand. "He's a guard dog. Ain't supposed to be soft. He was trained to protect my property. But he's useless now. Barely moves anymore. Hell, I was thinking of putting him down myself." James felt something snap inside him. Putting him down after forcing him to live like this? He took a step closer, his voice cold. "I'll make you a deal. I take the dog, and you never see me again. Otherwise..." James let his words hang in the air, his military stance making it clear that he wasn't asking. The man narrowed his eyes as if weighing his options. Then he spat onto the porch. "You want that useless mutt? Fine. Take him. Saves me the trouble." James didn't wait for another word. He turned on his heel and strode toward the dog. The German shepherd's ears twitched as James knelt beside him again. His breathing was shallow, exhaustion pressing down on his frail body. James hesitated, then reached forward, his fingers brushing against the thick, rusted chains. "I got you, buddy," he murmured. The chains were heavy, too heavy for a dog to carry for so long. James's jaw tightened as he unlatched the lock, his fingers working quickly. With a loud clang, the chains finally slipped off, falling into a heap on the ground. The shepherd flinched at the noise, instinctively lowering his head. But when he realized the weight was gone, he blinked, confused. For the first time in years, his neck was free. James ran a hand over his fur, feeling the deep indentations where the metal had pressed into his skin. "You're safe now." The dog looked up at him, uncertainty flickering in his dull brown eyes. He had spent so long suffering that he didn't seem to understand what had just happened. James could feel the tension in the dog's body, the hesitation, the fear of what came next. Carefully, he moved his hand toward the shepherd's paw again, offering it the same way he had before. For a long moment, the dog didn't move. Then, slowly, he lifted his paw and placed it into James's palm once more. James let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. This time, it wasn't just a plea for help. It was trust. Gently, James scooped his arms under the frail dog, lifting him off the ground. The shepherd barely had the strength to resist, his body weak from years of neglect. As James carried him toward his truck, the dog rested his head against his chest. As if already realizing that this man was different, James settled him onto a blanket in the back seat, making sure he was comfortable before shutting the door. Then, one last time, he turned toward the house. The man stood on the porch, watching them with an indifferent expression, a beer in his hand. He gave a lazy shrug. "Don't come back." James didn't answer. He climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly before starting the engine. As they drove away, James glanced at the rearview mirror. The dog's eyes were half closed, exhaustion pulling him towards sleep. But there was something else there too, relief. For the first time in years, he was leaving that place behind. But his journey wasn't over yet. James knew that saving him was only the beginning. Now he had to bring him back to life. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic sway of the truck should have been enough to lull the German shepherd into a deep sleep. But even as exhaustion weighed heavy on his body, his mind refused to rest. Every time his eyes closed, the sound of clinking chains echoed in his ears. The pressure on his neck, the hunger clawing at his stomach, the loneliness. It all still felt too real, even though he was no longer in that yard. His body didn't believe it yet. James Carter glanced into the rearview mirror, watching as the dog shifted slightly on the blanket. His bony frame was barely covered in patches of dull fur, his ribs protruding under his skin. Each breath he took looked like it required effort. This dog had been surviving on nothing but willpower. James exhaled sharply, gripping the wheel a little tighter. He had seen that kind of resilience before on the battlefield, in the eyes of soldiers who had been through hell and back. And just like those men, this dog wasn't broken. He just needed someone to show him the way back. The truck rumbled down a long stretch of road. The gas stations and rundown buildings gave way to open fields and scattered farmhouses. James's home wasn't much, a small ranch-style house with a wide backyard, but it was a place of peace, a place to heal. After 30 minutes, he finally pulled into his driveway, the tires crunching against gravel. The moment the truck stopped, the shepherd's ears flicked up slightly, a weak but noticeable reaction. Even after all those years of neglect, his instincts as a working dog were still there, buried beneath the suffering. James turned in his seat, giving him a reassuring look. "We're home, buddy." The shepherd didn't move. He only stared back at James with those tired, searching eyes, as if trying to decide if this was real or just another cruel trick. James grabbed the blanket underneath the dog and carefully lifted him into his arms. The shepherd barely weighed anything, too light for an animal his size. James felt a pang of anger at how badly he'd been treated, but he pushed it aside. Anger wouldn't help him now. Only patience would. As James carried him toward the house, a different set of paws thundered toward them. A large golden-furred Labrador mix bounded down the porch steps, barking excitedly. "Easy, Duke," James called out, shifting the shepherd slightly in his arms. Duke skidded to a stop, his tail wagging as he sniffed the air. His gaze landed on the weak dog in James's arms, and he let out a soft whine, his body language shifting immediately from excitement to concern. James knelt down, letting Duke get closer. The shepherd flinched slightly at first, his body tensing as if expecting an attack. But when Duke gently licked his face, his ears twitched, confusion flickering across his expression. James watched carefully, waiting to see if the shepherd would react aggressively. But he didn't. He just sat there, too tired to do anything but accept it. Duke wagged his tail, then trotted alongside James as he carried the shepherd inside. The warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the cold, damp ground the dog had spent years on. James laid him down on a soft dog bed near the fireplace, making sure he was comfortable before heading to the kitchen. He filled a bowl with fresh water and grabbed a can of wet food meant for malnourished dogs, knowing the shepherd wouldn't be able to handle dry kibble yet. When he set the bowl down in front of him, the dog hesitated. James frowned. "It's yours. Go ahead." The shepherd lowered his head slightly, his body stiff as if waiting for permission he had never been given before. James's chest tightened. Had he been punished for eating before? Had food been used as a weapon against him? The thought made his stomach churn. Carefully, James reached out, scooping a small amount of food onto his fingers before offering it. "It's okay," he said softly. The dog sniffed at his fingers, his body trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of moving. And then, finally, he took the food. James let out a slow breath, relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Duke settled beside the shepherd, curling up next to him as if sensing that he needed warmth. The shepherd didn't move away. He just lay there, letting the presence of another dog ground him in a way James never could. For the first time since leaving that miserable yard, the shepherd's eyes didn't hold as much fear. James knew there was a long road ahead, but tonight the dog would sleep in safety. The night passed in silence, save for the occasional crackle of the fireplace. James sat in his armchair nearby, his eyes drifting between the flickering flames and the two dogs curled up on the floor. Duke slept soundly, his golden fur rising and falling with each steady breath. But the German shepherd, despite his exhaustion, barely slept. Every few minutes, his body twitched, his ears flickering at the slightest sound. Even in safety, his mind was trapped in the past. James had seen this before, survivor's restlessness. It was the same look he'd seen in fellow soldiers, men who had returned from war but never truly left the battlefield. Even when they were home safe, their minds still expected danger around every corner. The shepherd was no different. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're not there anymore, buddy," he murmured. "Nobody's gonna hurt you now." The shepherd's eyes flickered open, just barely. He didn't lift his head, but his gaze found James in the dim glow of the fire. For a moment, they just stared at each other, man and dog, both carrying wounds deeper than the eye could see. James let out a slow breath, then leaned back, deciding to give the shepherd space. Healing would take time. By morning, the smell of fresh coffee filled the house, mixing with the scent of scrambled eggs sizzling on the stove. Duke was already up, wagging his tail expectantly at James's feet. The shepherd, however, was still curled up on the dog bed, his frail body rising and falling with slow, shallow breaths. James grabbed the bowl of wet food he had prepared the night before and knelt beside him. "Breakfast," he said softly. The shepherd lifted his head, blinking at the bowl. He still wasn't used to the idea of being fed. James scooped a bit of food onto his fingers again, offering it just like before. The shepherd hesitated, then took it. His jaw worked slowly as he swallowed. This time, James guided the bowl closer, watching carefully. The dog sniffed at it, his body still tense. But then, for the first time, he lowered his head and ate on his own. James felt something in his chest unclench. It wasn't just survival anymore. He was accepting care. After breakfast, James stepped outside onto the porch, inhaling the crisp morning air. The sky was a soft gray, a hint of rain in the wind. Today would be a test. He glanced back into the house, where the shepherd still lay curled on the bed. The chains around his neck were gone, but freedom was more than just losing shackles. It was learning to live without them. "Come on, buddy," James called gently. "Let's get you moving." Duke trotted over instantly, his tail wagging. The shepherd, however, didn't move. His ears flicked at the sound of James's voice, but his body remained stiff, his paws tucked beneath him. James sighed. He had spent so long chained in one place that he didn't know what to do with open space. Stepping back inside, James knelt beside him and rested a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," he said. "Come with me." The shepherd looked at him, his brown eyes searching for something, permission, reassurance, or maybe just understanding. James gave a small nod and slowly stood, walking toward the door. He didn't force him, didn't tug at him, just waited. Duke stood at the doorway, wagging his tail encouragingly, looking between James and the shepherd as if trying to tell him it's safe out here. Seconds passed, then a minute, then two, and finally, the shepherd moved. It was slow, almost painful to watch. His muscles stiff, his legs shaky, but he took a step forward, then another. James watched in quiet relief as the shepherd crossed the threshold of the house and stepped onto the porch. The cool breeze ruffled his fur. His nose twitched at the new scents, the damp earth, the trees, the faint smell of rain in the distance. This was freedom. Duke barked playfully, bouncing in front of him. The shepherd flinched slightly but didn't retreat. His eyes darted around, his body tense, but there was no chain pulling him back. James knelt beside him. "See? No more chains. No more cages." The shepherd turned to look at him, something uncertain yet hopeful in his gaze. For the first time, James truly believed that this dog, who had spent years in misery, was finally learning what it meant to be free. The shepherd stood motionless on the porch, his paws pressed against the wooden planks, as if testing whether the ground beneath him was real. The wind ruffled his patchy fur, and his nose twitched as he took in the unfamiliar scent of open land, damp earth, and freedom. James Carter sat down on the steps a few feet away, careful not to pressure him. The dog's entire life had been dictated by force. Someone yanking a chain, shoving him into submission, treating him like he was nothing more than a tool. But James wouldn't do that. Instead, he simply waited. Duke, ever the social one, bounced around in the grass playfully, chasing a fallen leaf. Every so often, He paused and looked at the shepherd, wagging his tail as if encouraging him to come down. But the shepherd didn't move. James exhaled slowly. He had spent years tied to one spot. The idea of stepping past an invisible boundary must have terrified him. So James made a choice. He stood up, walked off the porch and into the yard. Then, without a word, he turned his back on the shepherd and kneeled next to Duke. For an abused animal, being watched all the time was a source of stress, but sometimes, when they thought no one was looking, they were brave enough to take the first step. James didn't have to wait long. There was a soft shuffle behind him, then the sound of hesitant, unsteady footsteps on the porch. A heartbeat later, the shepherd stepped onto the grass. James didn't turn around. He let the moment belong to the dog. Duke wagged his tail wildly, clearly excited. He rushed forward and playfully nudged the shepherd's shoulder. The shepherd flinched, muscles tightening, but he didn't lash out. It was progress. James finally looked over his shoulder, watching the shepherd as he stood in the middle of the yard. His stance was stiff, his body still wary, but his eyes were filled with something different, curiosity. For the first time in years, he was seeing the world beyond the length of his chain. James gave him space to explore. He sat back and let Duke do most of the work, watching as his dog tried again and again to engage the shepherd. At first, the shepherd didn't respond. He kept his head low, glancing around as if expecting someone to grab him at any second. But Duke was patient. He bounded ahead, then circled back playfully, nudging him again. This time, the shepherd lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching. Then he took another step forward. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but it was the first time he had moved freely on his own. James felt a small smile tug at the corner of his lips. "That's it, buddy," he murmured. The shepherd kept moving, each step slow and uncertain, as if expecting the weight of a chain to pull him back at any moment. But it never did. By the time the sun had climbed higher in the sky, he had taken several laps around the yard. Duke trotted happily beside him, guiding him in a way only another dog could. James knew better than to think he was healed. Years of neglect couldn't be erased in a single morning. But watching the shepherd find his footing, seeing the way he hesitated just a little less with each step, was enough to tell James he was on the right path. After a while, the shepherd finally grew tired. His thin body still had little energy to sustain him, and James knew he had to take it slow. He clapped his hands gently. "Come on, let's get you some water." Duke trotted up the porch stairs without hesitation. The shepherd, however, froze. James frowned and looked back, his heart clenching. The shepherd stood at the edge of the yard, staring at the porch like it was a wall he couldn't cross. James realized the problem immediately. The shepherd had just spent years in a place where stepping off a porch meant stepping into pain. He had been chained up for so long that he now associated open space with danger. James swallowed hard. This was more than just physical healing. This dog needed to unlearn fear itself. So James tried again. He stepped up onto the porch and sat down. Duke followed his lead, curling up beside him. And then, just like before, James waited. Minutes passed. The shepherd stayed put, his legs shaking slightly. But James could see the battle happening inside him. Then, at last, he made his choice. With slow, shaky steps, the shepherd crossed the invisible line. He climbed the porch stairs, his breath uneven, his body still tense, but he did it. James felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't say anything, didn't move too fast, but in that moment, he knew this wasn't just survival anymore. This was the beginning of trust. The shepherd lay curled up on the dog bed by the fireplace, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. For the first time, he looked at peace. James Carter sat nearby, sipping his coffee, his gaze drifting toward the German shepherd every few minutes. Each small victory felt monumental. First getting to eat, then stepping off the porch, and now voluntarily resting without flinching at every sound. But James knew better than to assume the fight was over. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was a battle of steps forward and steps back. Duke, ever the loyal companion, lay beside the shepherd, his golden fur pressed against him. The shepherd still didn't seek affection, but he didn't move away either. That alone was progress. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're getting there, buddy," he murmured, his voice low and steady. The shepherd's ear twitched slightly, acknowledging the sound. He wasn't asleep, not fully. He never allowed himself to be, even in the safety of James's home. Some part of him remained alert. Years of conditioning didn't disappear overnight. James exhaled through his nose. He had one more test. Carefully, he stood and walked toward the back door. He whistled softly, calling Duke over. The Labrador mix perked up immediately, tail wagging. He padded to James's side. Then James glanced at the shepherd. "Come with us." The shepherd blinked, his body stiffening slightly. His eyes darted to the door, something about it unsettling him. James had a gut feeling he knew why. He had spent years watching his abuser walk in and out of doors, always leaving behind. James softened his voice. "You don't have to, but I promise it's safe." Duke turned toward the shepherd and let out a small, encouraging bark. He even walked over and nudged the shepherd's ear with his nose. The shepherd's ears flicked back. He was thinking, and then, after what felt like an eternity, he stood. James felt something warm spread through his chest. Another step forward. He opened the door, letting Duke bound outside first. The shepherd hesitated. His paws hovered at the threshold, his breathing heavier now, a sign of internal conflict. James didn't push. He just stepped outside himself and waited. Finally, the shepherd stepped through the door. The air was crisp, the scent of damp earth mixing with a faint aroma of pine trees in the distance. James's property stretched out behind the house, a fenced-in field, wide and open. The shepherd froze, taking it all in. James could only imagine what he was thinking. He had never known a world like this. Duke wasted no time. He sprinted into the field, barking excitedly, rolling in the grass. James watched as the shepherd's gaze followed him. His eyes filled with something James hadn't seen before, longing. The shepherd's body was still too weak to run, but his spirit was waking up. James knelt down in the grass, calling gently, "Come on, buddy." The shepherd flicked his ears back, but didn't move. James sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't ready yet. But then, Duke returned with something in his mouth. A ball. James recognized it instantly. It had been one of Duke's old toys, buried in the backyard somewhere. But Duke didn't bring it to James. He dropped it at the shepherd's feet. The shepherd flinched slightly, staring down at it. James's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a game. This was an offering. Duke wagged his tail, nudging the ball closer. "Play with me." The shepherd hesitated, his body trembling slightly. His entire life, he had only known orders, commands, fear. But this was different. James watched in silence as the shepherd lowered his head and very slowly nudged the ball back. Duke barked happily, grabbed it again, and took off running. The shepherd didn't chase him. He didn't have the strength yet, but his tail twitched. James nearly laughed in disbelief. He wasn't ready to run, but for the first time, he wanted to. The shepherd stood in the middle of the field, his paws pressed against the damp earth, his breathing slow and measured. For the first time in years, he wasn't just existing. He was feeling. Duke pranced a few feet ahead, the ball clutched in his mouth, his tail wagging wildly. He dropped it and barked once, tilting his head. "Come on, play with me." The shepherd didn't move. His body still carried the stiffness of a dog who has spent years trapped, weighed down by chains and fear. But his eyes were alive. James Carter watched the moment unfold from the porch, his arms crossed over his chest, his heart hammering harder than it should. He had spent weeks helping soldiers recover after war, some physically, others mentally. But none of them had taken a toll on him the way this dog had. The shepherd had been caged for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to be free. But standing here, with the wind rushing through his fur, the sun on his back, and a friend waiting to play, he was remembering. Duke gave a playful bounce, nudging the ball closer still. The shepherd hesitated, his muscles tensing, like he was waiting for a command that would never come. Was he allowed to do this? Was he allowed to just be a dog? Then it happened. The shepherd lifted his paw and pressed it against the ball. James let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. It was the smallest action, but it meant everything. Duke barked excitedly, nudging the ball again, and this time the shepherd pushed it back. It wasn't much, just a weak tap, but it sent Duke into a frenzy of excitement. He picked up the ball and took off running, his golden fur flashing in the sunlight. The shepherd's ears perked up, and James could see it. The desire, the forgotten instinct to chase. His body wasn't strong enough yet, his legs still shook when he walked. But when Duke turned back, waiting for him to follow, something shifted. The shepherd took a step forward, then another, and then he ran. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't graceful. His back legs struggled to keep up, his ribs showing with every movement. But he was running, truly running, and that was all that mattered. James swallowed hard, blinking against a sudden burn in his eyes. This dog had been shackled to the ground for years, and now he was defying everything that had tried to break him. The shepherd made it only a few yards before his legs wobbled, exhaustion creeping in. But when he stumbled, Duke was there, pressing against him, steadying him. And for the first time, the shepherd didn't flinch at being touched. James couldn't hold it back anymore. He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're incredible. You know that." The shepherd turned to look at him, his chest heaving from effort. His tail, once long held motionless, twitched once, then twice. James stepped off the porch and knelt in the grass. "The last test." "Come here, buddy," he called softly. The shepherd's ears flicked, his body freezing. His entire life, "come here," had never meant anything good. But James wasn't his old owner. He wasn't the man who had let him rot in chains, starving and alone. James was different, and the shepherd knew it. Slowly, hesitantly, he stepped forward. Each movement was cautious, like he expected the world to punish him for it. But James didn't move. He didn't rush. He just waited. The shepherd closed the distance between them, and then pressed his head against James's chest. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. This dog who had known nothing but suffering, was choosing to trust. James let out a shaky breath and slowly, carefully lifted his hand. He ran his fingers through the shepherd's fur, feeling every scar, every mark left behind by his past. The shepherd leaned into him. Duke wagged his tail wildly, bouncing around them in excitement. But James didn't move. He just closed his eyes for a second, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. This wasn't just rescue. This was rebirth. The shepherd had fought every battle meant to break him. He had survived the chains, the neglect, the hopelessness. And now, standing in the golden morning light, he had won. James smiled, his hand still resting against the shepherd's fur. "You're finally home, buddy." And this time, the shepherd's tail wagged.